Carrie, thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jesse. It's great to be here.
Awesome. So tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, and what you write about.
Right. So I started a company in January of 2020 called How, Highly Organized Woman. And I help people think strategically about productivity, performance, and leadership progression. Basically, I help people find more time in the day so that they have more time to work on whichever one of those aspects is the most critical at the moment. So I formed the company in January. I launched last July. And in between that time, I wrote my book and I self-published. And I ordered a whole lot of copies. So while I was, in the middle of the pandemic, I made good use of that time by writing the book.
That's awesome. So you were dealing with a pandemic, you were launching a company, and you were writing a book at the same time. Obviously, you teach on productivity, which is not a surprise given that situation. But how did you find time to make all that work?
Yeah, well, so that's right. That is exactly what I do is I help people find time. I think for me, there were a couple things. One is I had everything really well outlined. And so it's not anything revolutionary, but I had a lot of material and I decided to break it into 3 books. So I had spent some time sorting what content was going to go in which book and making sure that I had that situated. And then I also took a look at books that I thought would be competitive or would be in that same space. And so I spent a lot of time on Amazon and just in Google in general, looking for other options. I ordered some of those books. I spent some time skimming and reading and going, okay, that book is great, but my book is going to be different. And here's how. Or, oh, that book is really good. Maybe I should think about putting my own spin or using that setup, that fashion. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And then I just wrote a little bit more every single day.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned you had all this material, right, that you ended up splitting into 3 books. A lot of people that I talk to, they're like, okay, cool. I have X years of experience and I have all this information to share, but I have no idea how to begin to sort through that and put it together into a book. So how did you do that? What tips could you give someone who's maybe struggling with that?
Yeah, I think for me, mine was very easily broken down into 5 categories. All of the material that I had could be broken down that way. And then I realized while that was great, that wasn't going to be enough for a whole book. So even though I had enough in those 5 categories to stretch it across, I still needed some oomph at the beginning, some real content. I think if you're struggling, then start with your experience. What is it that you've done? And I'm a big fan of spreadsheets. So put in a spreadsheet, what have you done? What accomplishments have you had? Because that will likely start to trigger you into thinking about, oh, well, I closed this major deal. How did I do that? Well, because I'm really good at X, Y, and Z. And oh, I learned A, B, and C. And if you spend that time plotting out where your expertise lies, what activities or outcomes you had that made you that expert, and what lessons you learned, you will likely start to see patterns emerge.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes total sense. Switching directions slightly, did you ever struggle with any sort of mindset hurdles, maybe imposter syndrome or perfectionism or anything like that?
So it's funny. I quote Winston Churchill that perfection is the enemy of progress. And I think for a type A control person, perfectionist, what I did learn and what I was thinking about earlier is just start writing, and it doesn't have to be perfect. And so mine is written in sort of blog format. There's these little snippets. And so I just wrote one, and then I just wrote another, and I just wrote another. And I didn't worry about so much spelling, grammar. Did it really make a lot of sense? Like I went back and read after I was all finished. I went back and I was like, ooh, that is a mess. But if you just keep pushing forward and really just trying to make a little bit of progress every day, every other day, every week, depending on what your writing schedule is, those little accomplishments will add up and it will really start to build momentum.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So just to confirm, you didn't edit at all while you wrote. You wanted to get that whole manuscript done first. Is that how you worked through that?
I think that, I'm not sure I would say I didn't edit at all, but I didn't get hung up on too much about, is this gelling with this chapter? Is this section work with this section? I just kind of put it on paper. I mean, obvious if I autocorrect would fix some of the other errors, but I didn't worry so much about that and syntax as much as I did just get it down on a piece of paper, because then you could take a step back. I could read through the whole thing. I had other people read through it who I trusted and asked for their opinions. So a little bit of editing, but not major structural revisions until everything was on the page.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That's what I teach my students as well, is if you get so caught up in like writing a paragraph and then editing that paragraph, it's going to take you 17 years to write this book. So I definitely agree with that.
Exactly.
Going back to the beginning of your writing journey for a little bit, I just want to circle back to that. You wrote a book and kind of launched the company at the same time. And what I hear from a lot of people is, okay, well, I have to be in business for 5 years, or I have to have 100 client experiences before I can have the credibility and the expertise to write this book. What are your thoughts on that? Is that necessary? And I'm guessing no, because of how you did your journey.
Yeah, I think for me, it was almost the opposite. As I talked to people, they said, well, write a book because that will give you the credibility that you need to be able to say, I am an expert on this. Well, I have a book, So I don't think that's necessarily the case. Obviously, it wasn't for me. I think it was more about truly establishing that I had some credibility, that I could show someone a copy of my book. And honestly, at the beginning of the business, when I launched it, the book was more of an entree into speaking engagements. I was going to get hired. I was going to do keynote speeches, and they were going to give away my book at the end. Well, then, March 12th happened or whatever, and no one went outside for a while. So in that vein, I still think it was really valuable. It also helped me get my thoughts coalesced around my expertise, how to articulate that expertise, and what would make it business worthy. So I think if I had waited, my book would be very, very different if I wrote it today compared to when I wrote it last year. But I don't think I would have felt as confident launching the business with, I did the website, all the blogs, social media. I had all that verbiage because I had it all in the book.
I love that. It's kind of a chicken and an egg thing of like, okay, a book gives you credibility, but you also kind of need a bit of credibility to write a book. And so, what do you do first? And I think that's great what you were saying as well about, COVID kind of derailed it, but using your book to get that credibility, to get those speaking gigs, it's such a natural transition for people. So I encourage anyone who's thinking about writing a book to not just look at the book as the final product and we're done, but how can we leverage that? How can we grow with that? And really make it something that we can build a business off of, like you did.
Right. And especially if you're self-publishing like I did, I was on my own timeline. I was on my own schedule. It could look the way I wanted it to look. It could read the way I wanted it to read. I suspect my experience would have been very different had I gone through the traditional publishing route. So I do want to throw that caveat out there that if you are going to self-publish, the world is your oyster. You can do whatever, but then you are the sole captain of the ship, and you have to keep yourself motivated and on track to be able to make that progress.
Absolutely, 100%. Now, most of the people that are going to be watching this, they are entrepreneurs and they're writing their first nonfiction books. They've never gone through this process before. Do you have any parting advice you'd like to share with them to help them get to that final draft stage maybe a little bit more easily?
I have two nuggets of wisdom, if I can. One is there is the Nonfiction Writers Association, which has a nonfiction writers conference. It's always been virtual. It's usually in May. They had a plethora of resources. I was able to get connected to a few book coaches at the very beginning, and I just cannot speak highly enough of it. If you just don't know where to start with them. The second little nugget of wisdom I would say is I'm a big fan, and I talk about this in my business, of recurring reminders. So whatever digital to-do list tool you use, doesn't matter, but set a recurring reminder, whether it's every day, every other day, or once a week, that you're going to work on your book. Instead of putting it in your calendar, because if you put it in for 4:00 and then something comes up and you don't get to it, you feel as though you have been defeated. If you have it in your to-do list, then it doesn't matter when you do it. It doesn't matter how much you work on it. It doesn't matter what time of the day, But every time that appears on your to-do list, you just start chipping away at the book, and pretty soon you'll find yourself on a roll and you'll be finished in no time.
Awesome. That's a great tip. Carrie, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.